Valorant has added 14 different agents since beta. Each of these changes have further pushed design, either coming up with original ideas or adapting creative ideas from other games and incorporating them into Valorant's tac shooter design. In this video, we're going to go over every single new addition since beta that was added, talk about what they exactly innovated on and the unique features that each agent offered, and predict what abilities could be added in the future for Valorant. Now, we're a new channel that posts every single week, so we would really appreciate a like and subscribe, and let's get into the video. Now, after beta, the first character that was introduced in 1.0 with the launch of the game was actually Reyna. Now, when Reyna was first released, there was a lot of controversy at the time. A character that had great mobility and a way to heal herself past her natural limit with armor on top of that in the form of overshield. And while incredibly powerful effects, they're not new for shooters. They have been used a lot, but in tac shooters, pretty much unheard of. But the thing is, these abilities were behind a kill wall, meaning that Reyna needed to get kills in order to access either of these abilities, dismiss or devour. Now, at the time when the character was first released, Reyna had to get final blows on characters. She just couldn't be a part of killing an enemy, something that was patched out much later on. Now, this was also the introduction of a character that felt very solo rank oriented, a character that was designed to be a solo carry character if you had the mechanical skill. This character was built to leverage that into tons of tactical advantage. The next up in patch 1.05, Killjoy was introduced. And this character actually innovated in another core way that once again was pretty controversial at the time. It might still be a bit, and that was auto-firing turrets. And in a tac shooter, that's kind of blasphemy, right? Tac shooters are known for being historically high skill floor, meaning it's hard to pick up, high skill ceiling, specific, precise, and most importantly, everything that a auto-firing turret is not. And I really do think that Riot created Killjoy as one of the second characters they introduced as a stand against what other tac shooters are in the past, really separating them from games like Counter-Strike, where it's like, we are willing to do anything. Anything that you think that we won't do, we're willing to do in Valorant, and this is the perfect example of it. This is the least tac shooter thing you could probably think of, an auto-firing turret, and we're gonna make it our second character. That is crazy to me still. But regardless, they did do it, and Killjoy definitely warped the meta around her quite substantially and still warps the meta around her to this day. Now, Killjoy also innovated in other ways, like having an ultimate that completely forced enemies to play around it, respect it, or even come up with counter plans like lineups to deal with it. I would still argue that Lockdown is one of the most powerful ultimates to this day, even after 12 more agents have been introduced. Now, moving on to 1.11, we actually got Skye. Skye was the first initiator introduced into the game, and there was a couple of core innovations that came with Skye. First off, she had a flash that could be guided. That was something that was very unique. Having things that could be guided wasn't that unique. Similar to Sova Drone, she had a dog that she could gather information with, but having a flash that could be guided was definitely very, very unique for a tactical shooter in general. In addition to that, an ultimate that tracked enemies, auto-tracked them, was definitely an interesting mechanic that allowed Skye to run out with her ultimate and still follow up, having her gun out the entire time. Now, all three of these characters, Reyna, Killjoy, and Skye, that were introduced from 1.0 to 2.0, all of these characters offer something unique, and I think that some of these types of abilities or the precedent that their abilities set could be used in future designs. Having other abilities that auto-target or have the capability to lock down certain areas or gather information without you being there. Having controllable things that provide more than just information. One of the things that I think of when I think of the guiding light flash that you can control, I think of Call of Duty RCXD, which is literally an explosive on a remote control car. We have lots of things that you can move and control. Why not something that does damage that you can move and control? Now, I'm not saying any of these things are good ideas. I'm not a designer. All I'm saying is that Valorant has set the precedent for these things to be introduced in the game, and the more and more ideas they use, the more likely we will see overlapping or reusing some ideas from previous agents and incorporating them into new agents in different ways. The next up, 2.0 introduced Yoru, and this is not the Yoru of today because he did receive the most dramatic rework that we've seen in Valorant up to this point, but that was not until 4.04. In 2.0, Yoru had a different kit, but the main difference was that he could do fake footsteps. He didn't have the hologram, he had the ability to trick enemies by making a fake sort of footsteps. An ability that gave enemies false information, tricking one of their senses that they then played on with his decoy effect that eventually tricked enemies' sight as well as their hearing. Now, he also could go invisible and teleport. Invisible in his ultimate that he could pop out of, and teleport altogether to a place that one of his abilities marks. Now, the thing about Yoru that's really interesting is a lot of his abilities could set precedent for future agents because of how unique they are. The ability to trick enemies via sound or just completely trick enemies via senses is very freaking powerful in attack shooter where you're really relying on what you see and what you hear. So even an ability as a hypothetical that could cut sound for 2, 3, 4 seconds from everything you do could be incredibly powerful in a game like Valorant. Being able to kill somebody without them knowing where you're shooting from or without them knowing where you're coming from. Or even abilities of a trickster, someone that could turn into different things on the map, can disguise themselves along walls, or can just go invisible altogether, but maybe it's like a sort of camouflage, like I'm thinking past Halo games. But something that's important to point out is that Omen already had a teleport ability. Yoru added a very different variation of it, but the same core idea used in multiple different ways can feel like an entirely new ability, and I wouldn't be surprised if lesser versions of ultimates from previous characters are then repurposed for abilities in future characters, or vice versa, where we take an ability and we make a much stronger version of it for someone's ultimate. Now in 2.04, we got Astra, and Astra offered a ton. And if y'all don't remember, Astra was completely busted on release to an extreme example. But Astra could pre-round place abilities or place markers called stars that she could use to activate her abilities. And this was really powerful and very unique, being able to go into a completely different dimension that allowed you to place down abilities. This was really pushing the bounds of what was possible in Valorant, kind of further showing that anything is possible with future agent designs. Now, in addition to that, she could activate a multitude of other abilities, whether that was a stun, a pull CC, or a smoke. None of these are greatly unique, but the way that they were utilized through the stars that you placed pre-round was incredibly unique. And then, of course, her ultimate, while not being something that's unique in gaming, a giant wall that you cannot hear through or shoot through. This idea has been used a ton, but having it in attack shooter was the first. This is the first that we've seen, and Astra being able to set it on a fly, using it to do all kinds of sneaky things, definitely pushing the bounds of what is possible overall as a character. But after they introduced all these crazy things, crazy utility, crazy abilities, they have to go back to the character that is basically in every single type of hero shooter, and that's the disabled character, the character that could turn things off. And in 3.0, they introduced KO. And KO had multiple ways to turn abilities off, with the knife that gathered info and turned off abilities for a short amount of time, or his ultimate that turned off all abilities within a certain range. And KO's just a strong freaking character because the more abilities you introduce into a game, the more powerful the ability to turn those off becomes. And the thing is, this type of effect is not unique at all. In fact, it's used in so many different games, but especially in Valorant, we got to see just how powerful something that could deal with all this crazy utility was. And KO also introduced something that no one thought they would ever see in attack shooter, the ability to resurrect someone that's fallen. Something that looks like Last Stand from Call of Duty. You could bring someone back alive. That's what you could do with KO. Now, we've seen different variations of the resurrect mechanic being used in Valorant, whether it's the resurrect itself from Sage or the ability that Clove now has to resurrect themselves. KO did it in a way that echoed the mechanics of many other Battle Royale games and repurposed it for Valorant, which is something that we'll see a lot from now on. It's just interesting abilities in other games brought into Valorant and then kind of thrown into the sandbox and see how it works. Now, in Valorant 3.1, we got Chamber introduced, and this character was a Sentinel, unlike any Sentinel we've seen before. Chamber had the ability to bring out his own guns. He could bring out his own deagle. That was incredibly powerful. He could bring out his own operator. And the thing is, these effects or these type of effects weren't that new because characters like Jet and Raze had the ability to whip out their own guns, but not quite like Chamber that had literal gun replacements and guns with an incredibly high mechanical skill ceiling, especially his deagle. Now, once again, we see an innovation on the teleport ability. This is the third time that a teleport ability was used in the game. First, it was Omen, then it was Yoru, and now Chamber. But every single one of these feel fundamentally different than one another. And Chamber's being able to be used at a very fast rate allowed him to take an aggressive position, challenge an enemy, and then get out safely. But more important than that, it cemented Chamber's identity as a Sentinel, but he himself was the turret if we compare him to a character like Killjoy. he himself was the one gathering information. He himself was the one taking contact with the enemy, and he himself was being able to take these aggressive positions. But even if he missed a shot or got in a bad position, he could get out safely. This further pushed the bounds of what a Sentinel could be, and definitely could give you some ideas about what type of agent a Sentinel could be in the future. Now, moving along to 4.0, we got Neon. And the thing about Neon is Neon could be pulled straight from another game, and that would seem reasonable. Like, the character didn't really innovate on anything that crazy. The ability to have your own weapon, the ability to slide, the ability to run. None of these things are very crazy, but when thrown into a tac shooter environment, all of a sudden, they're incredible. You see, in most tac shooters, timing is everything. Being able to predict the flow of enemies, being able to predict where enemies could possibly be, and Neon really messed with that timing, operating a step faster than everyone else in the lobby, meaning that whether she was being aggressive or retaking or rotating, she was always just a little bit faster than enemies could predict her to be, and this was incredibly powerful. Neon really didn't innovate on any new mechanics for shooters in general, actually at all, but she did bring something to tac shooters that have never been there before. And it kind of shows you the power of just taking an effect in another game, and bringing it into Valorant can be really, really interesting because of how different Valorant is from other shooters, especially non-tac shooters. Now, before we get to our next agent, in 4.04, we did have the Yoru rework, and this was where he got his new version of Decoy that was a hologram. Enemies shot it, and it would turn and flash them. And this is another mechanic that's pulled from other games. The thing I think of the most is like the hologram decoy effect in Halo, where enemies could literally get tricked by it. Or like Apex's Mirage, where you could get shot by it, and now if you shoot it incorrectly, the enemy Mirage gets some sort of advantage. So it further incentivizes them to really, really trick you. And I think this was a perfect rework to Yoru because it furthers the idea of tricking enemies or having enemies second guess, right? Either enemies second guess their decisions, and in that split second, you get a tactical advantage, or enemies make the wrong decision and get fully tricked, and then you use that to just completely destroy them. Either way, this trick type character is so much more effective in a tactical shooter environment than literally any other type of environment because of how fast the time to kill is. Even a moment's hesitation can be so dramatic in a game like Valorant that really emphasizes how powerful being able to trick someone is, and I think Yoru is the perfect example of that, and the abilities that were introduced was the perfect example of that. Now, I think that they could go a lot further with the trick aspect of Yoru, but maybe it would go too far. If the game is filled with characters that all could trick you or provide you false information, then no one would start believing any sort of information at all, and it would probably descend into chaos. So perhaps they're thinking about that actively when they design new characters. Even though these kind of abilities are really powerful, it could get overwhelming if there's too many of them, so they have to ratio them appropriately with the introduction of new characters. Now, in 4.08, this is where Fade was introduced, and I actually think that Fade offered the least amount of innovation up to this point because a lot of Fade's abilities are just different variations of abilities that came before. I would say the most unique aspect of Fade was the idea that if you marked someone with a trail, then your abilities had a path to follow that led directly to them. And this type of hunter-tracker aspect was definitely a unique effect on the character, but other than that, I think for the most part, the character did very similar things to other characters, just in different ways. Now, I actually don't think that this is a bad thing for character design. Not every single character needs to push the evolution of Valorant agents forward. In fact, there is a point where you need to stop pushing and pushing and pushing, or else the power creep and the overall craziness of the game can get too out of hand. And it's also important that there are characters that can have similar abilities to other characters, but then different overall kits, meaning that characters could provide similar value in some ways, but different value in others, and that might be better fit for the job. So instead of having, a hammer and a knife to do two different jobs, you have a big hammer and a slightly smaller hammer and like a slightly different shaped hammer, all to do slightly different jobs, but could still do the same core job. I hope that analogy made sense. If it didn't, let me know down below. Now, next up was 5.08, and this character was Harbor. And Harbor innovated in several unique ways. We did need a line smoker, as previously to Harbor, we only had one other one in Viper, and Harbor went about it a very different way. having walls or smokes that could actually curve, having a ball that could actually prevent bullets and could be destroyed so you could shoot through it, but couldn't actually be removed so you wouldn't see line of sight no matter what. Having an ultimate that tracked onto specific characters' locations in a set area. There was a lot about Harbor that was innovation. There was a lot about Harbor that was new. I really do think that this is really a great character to showcase what is possible with Valorant controllers and what will probably be possible in the future. I think other characters that could literally create smokes with a paintbrush, being able to create creative designs, little tunnels, weird shapes, or specific smokes that could just help you in certain situations. Well, you can do that to an extent with a character like Brim, throwing multiple smokes to give you like a snail's path. Imagine a character that had like a meter and a paintbrush that could draw a certain design. That would be something that I would think would be very possible, combining the elements of Brim and Harbor together. In fact, the whole concept of dome and line smokers can be broken by Harbor's identity, who doesn't necessarily follow a straight line, nor following the idea of a single dome smoke as well. And I do think that we can further push this idea forward more and more, having controllers that can follow more untraditional paths, and further innovating on what exactly a line of sight smoke looks like. I think we're going to see some really interesting things going forward. Now in 6.04, we had Gecko. And Gecko offered two really unique things to the design formula. Number one is the ability to send out something that literally planted for you. That interaction is crazy strong and unique. And I think that Gecko found the right balance between it being a strong ability but not an overpowered ability. You could really understand how being able to mess with the spike can become incredibly overpowered depending on the simple changes to it. Like as an example, what if there was an ultimate that could unplant a spike? Seems incredibly broken, right? What if Yoru's fake character could go and walk with a spike and then plant it? Also seems really freaking powerful. I think Gecko's ability that's the perfect combination of being very valuable but also risky, because if it gets shot, then the spike could get stranded, is a really important aspect of the ability that I think makes it so it's not overbearing and too overly powerful. But I imagine that abilities that fundamentally change the rules of Valorant in some important way, Riot makes double and triple sure that they're not a little bit too overpowered. Now, 7.0 introduced us to Deadlock, another Sentinel on the roster, and this character was quite a bit different from other Sentinels, with the exception of Sage, the character that she's the most similar to. Deadlock is a spatial denial character, the ability to deny enemies certain aspects of the map. And there were several innovations that actually came with Deadlock. Number one, a sound sensor that went off with the sound that enemies made or punished them for being overly loud. This is something that I think could be innovated on in the future, something that punishes enemies for doing a certain thing, whether it's loud or maybe it's a certain area that goes off when an ability is triggered or something along those lines. I could see some type of set things where it's like if this, then this, right? An if-then ability. And then Deadlock also innovated with a wall that could be shot through but not be walked through. A physical thing that gave people information but didn't give people the ability to move through it unless it was destroyed, and it was very hard to destroy. And then last and definitely most shocking was Deadlock's ultimate, which literally trapped enemies in a cocoon that, unless they were freed, they would just die. Not completely unique in the fact that it could kill enemies. I mean, Raze's ult still exists, and other ults as well, weapons like Neon and Jets, but in Spectacle, I think it kind of blew those out of the water and also created interesting decision making for the person that was in the clutch up situation about how to go about saving their teammate or winning the duel. Now in 7.09, there was ISO, and ISO offered two pretty interesting abilities. Number one was the ability to put a shield over himself that tanked one source of damage. At the time, he needed to get a kill to activate, but now can activate it right away after a rework to the character. An incredibly powerful ability that allows him to literally tank an op shot or a headshot and still stay alive with no damage on him. And this is a really powerful precedent, the ability to become immortal or not take any damage. I can imagine an ultimate in the future very similar to something that maybe for the next 3 seconds you're literally invulnerable or something along those lines. Some type of Mario Superstar type stuff. Now, personally, do I think this is good for design? No, but you know, it's kind of the bag of worms that is opened. ISO created that, especially the rework. And then the other innovation with ISO was the domain expansion ultimate, the ability to take an enemy into your arena and fight them mano a mano, one-on-one. Now, because of ISO's kit, you can really stack the deck in your favor. You already get 2 pieces of cover, but the ability to have an overshield before you fight an enemy means that you're kind of favored to win by quite a margin. And being able to literally take people out of the map in a zone that it's impossible for enemies to interact with is very strong. But you can definitely see how this looks to be inspired by characters like Mordekaiser in League of Legends. You see, Riot has a ton of different characters in League of Legends that they can take inspiration from, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just keep taking ideas from League and try to incorporate them in interesting ways into Valorant for the future. Then the last but certainly not least character, in 8.05, Clove was introduced. Clove got to play with death in a way that no other characters could. Not only could Clove resurrect themselves after death and give themselves a new chance at life, but also Clove could smoke for their team even if they did die in their close proximity. The combination of these 2 things created a character that feared death less than other characters in the game. And I do think that this aspect of giving characters something to do after they're dead, or some responsibility after they're dead, is something that we're going to see a lot in the future. Imagine a character that has spirit familiars and can take control of them after death or create them. A character that could gather information, a character that could lie traps. There's a lot of potential with the abilities of Clove to be used in future characters. Now that we have the entire evolution of Valorant agents laid out in front of us, what abilities or ultimates do you want to see introduced in Valorant from other games or of your own design? Let us know why down below and what you would do best to balance them properly and introduce them into the Valorant sandbox in a relatively balanced way. If you enjoyed the content, press that subscribe button because we want to get well on our way to 1,000 subscribers. And thank you so much for coming by. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.